It's 1975, and there's a man in Oregon who owes a Japanese company $1 million that he doesn't have. His checks are bouncing, and his bank just called the FBI on him for fraud.
FBI, open
And for most people, this would be the day that their company dies. The company that I'm talking about is Nike. And as you know, if you're watching this, it didn't die. Actually, it does about $46 billion a year in revenue and is the most valuable sports apparel brand in the entire world. So today we're going to go back to the part before Jordan and before Just Do It, when the guy who built Nike spent 16 years, one bounce check from done. Before I do that, let me show you how big this got, because that's actually what makes this whole thing so crazy. Today, Nike is actually headquartered on a campus in Beaverton, Oregon that looks like a university, and it's doing around $46 billion in sales a year. And it's the most valuable sports apparel brand in the world. Now, Phil Knight actually stepped back from running it in 2016, and he's worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $35 billion. He's actually given away over $2 billion of it, and most of that went to like the old universities that he graduated from. Now, a quick thing before we start. I read Knight's book, Shoe Dog, a while back, and this is the part of it that stuck with me the most. What most of these founder origin stories do is sell you the genius idea or the big vision or whatever it is that the main character had. But this one is about something nobody really teaches, and that's surviving. Staying in the game. I don't like it when we call business a game, but staying in the game when everything tells you that you should get out. And that's what this is. It starts back in 1962 with a guy who had no business starting a shoe company and a paper that he wrote in school that he just could not get out of his head. So, just to set the stage a little bit, Phil Knight was born in Portland, Oregon in 1938. His dad ran a newspaper, and Phil was a decent middle distance runner at the University of Oregon. He ran about a 413 mile. I guess that's good. I'm not a runner. I don't know. And he ran for a famously intense track coach named Bill Bowerman. Now, I want you to remember that name because it's going to come up again and again throughout this story. After college, Knight actually spent a year in the Army, and then he went to Stanford to get his MBA. And this is kind of where the seed of the idea was planted that would eventually grow into what we know as Nike. Knight actually took a small business class in college taught by a professor named Frank Schallenberger. And that's where it really all started, not with a product or a company, with a paper for an assignment. And that assignment was just to dream up a business. Now, Knight, who loved running and had noticed something, wrote a paper arguing for one specific idea. And that idea was this: that the same way that cheap, high quality Japanese cameras had just eaten the lunch of expensive German camera companies. For example, Nikon had come for Leica, which I've never even heard of, by the way. Cheap, high quality Japanese running shoes could come for the expensive German shoe companies that owned the sport at the time. Stuff like Adidas and Puma and so on. What he realized is that there was a gap and that Japan could fill it. Now, I want you to notice what this paper actually is, because it's really the first thing that built Nike. It wasn't an invention. He didn't invent the shoe, although later he would go on to say that someone invented the shoe thousands of years ago, and the only change that it's had in that time was that they started making a left foot and a right foot shoe. But he didn't invent the shoe, and he didn't invent Japanese manufacturing. What he did was he saw a wave forming, a quality and price gap in a market everybody else thought was settled, and he saw it before anyone else bothered to look. And that is exactly how a lot of great companies start. They get in front of a wave. Knight happened to find his in a classroom, but every great company that started with a wave finds theirs in a different way. And by the way, he got an A on that paper, and most people would have just filed it away and gone on to get a normal job. But he couldn't let it go. So after graduation, Knight goes and he talks to his dad, and he convinces him to fund a trip for him around the world. Lucky Knight, right? And it was part adventure, sure, but part of it in the back of his mind was chasing the idea from his paper. And on that trip in November of 1962, he made his way to Kobe, Japan, and tracked down a company that made a running shoe called the Tiger. That company was called Onitsuka. And what he did, he managed to talk his way into a meeting with the executive, And in that room, they ask him what is the obvious question: what company do you represent? And the thing is, Knight didn't have a company at this time. He was just somebody with a dream and a paper that he wrote in college that he was trying to make a reality. He basically had a school paper and a plane ticket. So instead of just saying, I don't have one, he thought about the wall of blue ribbons he won as a kid. And he said, gentlemen, I represent Blue Ribbon Sports of Portland, Oregon. Yeah, he had literally made the company up right there on the spot in front of a bunch of Japanese executives of a major shoe brand that he was trying to get to sell. He literally just pulled it out of thin air because there was no Blue Ribbon Sports. He invented the name in the half second before he answered the question. And the thing is, it worked. I can relate to this a little bit because my first company was called Superstar SEO. And I spent all of 30 seconds choosing that name when I was forced to pick a name because I was starting to like launch my business. And what I did was I was really into wrestling at the time, and I named it after professional wrestlers because WWE referred to their wrestlers as superstars rather than wrestlers. And that's where I got the name. So this part of the story really connects for me. Anyway, he walked out with the rights to sell Onitsuka Tiger shoes in the Western United States, and he wired his father $50 to pay for the samples. The whole empire starts with a lie of pure confidence in a room in Kobe and a borrowed $50. Now, the samples that Onitsuka was going to send it to him to sell took more than a year to show up. And when they finally did, Knight mailed 2 pairs to his old coach, Bill Bowerman, remember him? Hoping to sell him a few pairs and maybe get an endorsement. He wasn't expecting anything more than that. And the thing is, Bowerman didn't want to buy the shoes. Bowerman wanted in. He offered to become Knight's partner and to start tearing the shoes apart and redesigning them because Bowerman had spent years cobbling together shoes for his own runners, convinced he could build something lighter and faster that would help them get better times and then help them win. So on January 25th, 1964, the two of them shook hands and they each put in $500, $1,000 total. That's the entire funding capital of what ended up becoming Nike. The split was 51-49 with Knight holding the controlling share, which was Bowerman's own suggestion, so somebody had final say. And Knight keeping final say is something that's going to come back later in this story, so remember that. Now, their first order was for 300 pairs of Tiger shoes. And they had their distribution and sales system at the time was actually really, really complex. And by really complex, I mean, Knight drove to high school and college track meets around the Pacific Northwest, popped the trunk of his green Plymouth Valiant, and sold running shoes to runners and coaches out of the back of his car. And in the first year of sales was about $8,000. And that's about $80,000 into 2026 dollars. So for a guy just going to high schools and colleges and selling them out of his car, that's incredibly impressive. And the thing is, at this point, Knight had a day job, and he didn't quit his day job to do this because he couldn't afford to yet. He was working as a certified public accountant. He had an actual job at an accounting firm, and later he taught accounting at a university. This was side hustle for him at the time. And for years, Blue Ribbon Sports was the thing he did on nights and weekends and at track meets because it didn't make enough money for him to live on yet. The founder of Nike kept his accounting job for years because his shoe company couldn't pay him. Also, it's important to know that at this point, Knight wasn't doing this entirely alone. His dad funded the original trip and the first samples, and he also met a woman named Penny in the late 60s who was a Portland State student who took his accounting class. She ended up working at Blue Ribbon in the early years and eventually became his wife. At one point, Knight even realized that she wasn't even cashing her paychecks, just leaving them in a drawer so the company would have more cash to operate with. Through every brutal stretch of the next decade or so, and we're going to get into that, including the one that we opened on, by the way, Penny was in the building for all of it. The lone wolf founder thing is mostly a Hollywood invention. Now, it does happen, but nobody does it all on their own. Everybody has somebody that helps them, whether it's directly or indirectly. And then the other thing that made the early company work was a guy named Jeff Johnson. Jeff was Blue Ribbon's actual first full-time employee other than Knight. And Johnson was, there's no other way I can think of to put it, he was a fanatic. He sold shoes obsessively. This guy in the 1960s, keep in mind, built a handwritten card file on individual customers with their shoe size, their times, their injuries, and he wrote them personal letters. He even opened the company's first retail store in Santa Monica. If you can get yourself a Jeff Johnson in your company, please do it. I have one or two that I'm fortunate enough to work with. They are worth more than you can ever imagine. The thing is, and that's because this guys like Johnson believed in this thing harder than Knight did sometimes. So hold on to Johnson too, because there's going to be a lot more of him later on in the story as well. By the end of the 1960s, they've got themselves a real little business. A few stores, around 20 employees, and sales are climbing toward $300,000 a year in 1960s money. So that's pretty significant. Around this time, Knight finally was able to quit the accounting work to work on Blue Ribbon full time. And from the outside, it looks like a normal small company growing up. But from the inside, it was about to start the most insane 16-year financial high wire act in modern business history, if not in world history. And that was because of the way that Knight chose to grow the company. Everything that almost killed this company over the next decade comes from a single decision that Knight made about how he wanted to grow. Now, every single year, Knight set out to roughly double the company. And the way you double a shoe company is you order twice as many shoes as last year. But to order twice as many shoes, you need cash that you don't have because last year's money is already spent. You see the problem? So what Knight did was he borrowed a lot, every dollar he could get and more. He took every cent of profit and every cent of loan and poured it straight back into a bigger order. And what that meant was that no matter how much he sold, he was always out of money. On paper, he was growing like an absolute rocket. But in the bank account, he was dead broke. All the time on purpose. Now, most people think being broke is a symptom of doing business badly. And in some cases, that's true. But for Knight, being broke was a strategy of a business doing incredibly well. He chose growth over safety every single year deliberately. There's a name for that knife edge, and it's called being undercapitalized, growing faster than your money can support. It's the most dangerous thing you can do in business, and it's also how a lot of the biggest companies on earth actually got as big as they are. So there is a case for it, but it's dangerous and it's stressful. And the line between fastest grower in the industry and bankrupt is one bad month. And Knight, he walked that line for 16 years. And here's another part of it. And the people whose entire job is to hate that strategy are the bankers. Knight's bank and then the next bank kept telling him the exact same thing. You're growing too fast. You have no cash. You have no equity. Show us retained earnings. Slow down. They capped what they would lend him and basically the value of what he already owned, which for a company that spent everything was almost nothing. Knight got effectively thrown out of 2 Oregon banks in a few years for refusing to stop growing. You see, bankers don't think the way that founders and entrepreneurs do. They think in terms of numbers and of spreadsheets. And here's the thing. On paper, they were right. On every spreadsheet, by every rule of sound finance, Knight was running a dangerous, irresponsible company. Now, to be clear, the bankers weren't villains. They were just doing their job and being responsible. They were right, but Knight just decided that he was more right, that the opportunity was worth the risk, and that slowing down to be safe meant losing the wave that he'd bet everything on. The thing is that sometimes the responsible people telling you no are right about the risk and wrong about whether to take it. And that's counterintuitive, but it's just true. And being able to know the difference is everything. And Knight bet his entire life that he knew the difference. But let's not romanticize this. One domino not falling at the exact right time could have ended it all for Knight. And it nearly did, repeatedly, actually. Knight made a lot of low odds decisions and routinely came out on top. So I just want to be clear about that it worked out for him and it has worked out for other people, but for everyone that's worked out, there's a whole line of people that haven't. So I just don't want to over romanticize that. But anyway, what happened was this left Knight with the question, if American banks wouldn't fund the growth, who would? And the answer was a giant Japanese trading company called Nisho Iwai. At the time, it was the 6th largest trading house in Japan, doing around $100 billion a year. And then starting in 1971, Nisho agreed to finance Blue Ribbon's shoe orders to front the money for the inventory that the banks wouldn't touch because they thought it was too risky. And what Nisho did was they took a small cut on top and charged their interest. In exchange, they became the financial machine under the whole operation. Without Nisho, there is no Nike today, full stop. The banks would give him a little. Nisho actually gave him the runway to double year after year after year. And that wasn't all Nisho did to save Nike, by the way. And it wasn't even Nike at this point. But that's not all Nisho did to save them. In a few minutes, we're going to talk about how they walked into a room and saved the company's life on the worst day for Nike in this entire story. But it's important to note that there was a crack in the foundation at this time. The thing is, Blue Ribbon didn't actually own anything. It just sold somebody else's shoes. It resold Tigers made by Onitsuka. They were just a reseller at this point. And around 1971, Knight found out that Onitsuka was shopping for a bigger American distributor to replace him and had floated buying control of Blue Ribbon out from under him. Knight was completely dependent on a partner that was preparing to drop him. So he made the move then that makes him Phil Knight. He decided to secretly build his own brand. Shoes that Blue Ribbon would own outright, so it would never again be at the mercy of a supplier. But the thing is, he needed a name and a logo, and he needed them fast. The name came from Jeff Johnson, the fanatic that we talked about earlier. The way Knight tells it is that Johnson woke up one morning with the name, Nike, the Greek goddess of victory. Knight was not sold on it at all. His own favorite name was Dimension 6. What? Which, let's be honest, is genuinely terrible. Thank God they didn't go with that. He ended up picking Nike mostly because the deadline was on top of him and he had to choose something. And as he put it later, he just hoped it would grow on him over time. Oh, and that famous logo, the swoosh, the way he got that was he commissioned that from a graphic design student at Portland State where he was teaching. Her name was Carolyn Davidson. Now, she billed him for her hours, which was $35. Knight looked at the swoosh and said, and this is a real quote, "I don't love it, but it'll grow on me." This $35 story gets told online a lot, like Knight robbed her. And yeah, the first invoice was $35. Davidson kept doing work for Nike for years. And then in 1983, Knight called her into a room and handed her a gold swoosh ring and 500 shares of Nike stock. Stock that after decades of splits is worth millions of dollars today. And she said that she's never even sold it. So it wasn't a student getting ripped off. It's a better story than that. It was a guy who, when he had nothing, paid $35. And then when he had everything, remembered who drew the check mark. Both halves are true, but most people only tell you the first one. Now, by the early 70s, Knight wasn't really running this alone either. He had a small inner circle around him, a handful of weird, loyal misfits, mostly ex-runners, and they called themselves the Butt Faces. You can't make this stuff up. They would actually meet at annual retreats, they'd yell at each other, and they had no titles. And this was Knight's actual management style, and the Butt Faces were the people in the room every time the company nearly died. And the brand had a secret weapon, Bowerman, still tinkering. His first shoe was actually called the Cortez, designed in the late 60s and named for the Spanish conquistador. The Cortez was at the center of Onitsuka lawsuit because both companies claimed that they invented it. Then, in 1971, frustrated that no shoe gripped his team's new track service, Bowerman poured liquid urethane onto his wife's waffle iron to see if a waffle pattern made a better sole. He ruined that waffle iron, and I'm sure that got him in trouble with his wife that night. But he was onto something. It led a few years later to the Waffle Trainer, the second blockbuster for what was then called Nike. And that ruined waffle iron, by the way, got dug up years later and now sits in Nike's archives. So Onitsuka found out about the Nike line and the partnership detonated. Both sides sued each other. Blue Ribbon said Onitsuka broke the deal by trying to replace them. Onitsuka said Blue Ribbon stole the business. It ended up going to federal court in Portland in 1974, and Blue Ribbon won. And about a week after the ruling, Onitsuka settled for $400,000, which for a company that lived with zero cash in the bank was an absolute lifeline. Now, the new Nike branded shoes officially launched at the 1972 US Olympic trials in Eugene, Oregon on Bowerman's home track. It was the company's coming out moment, the day Blue Ribbon stopped selling somebody else's shoes and started being a brand of its own. And shortly after that, Nike signed its first real track star, a 21-year-old Oregon runner named Steve Prefontaine, the most charismatic American distance runner of his generation, who held every American outdoor record from 2,000 to 10,000 meters. Bowerman had actually coached him at Oregon. And to get around the laws regarding paying college athletes, Knight gave him a paycheck and an unofficial title, National Director of Public Affairs, and Pre became the face of the brand. So by the mid-70s, own brand, won the lawsuit, a hit shoe, growing like crazy, Nishu funding the orders. It sounds like they finally made it, right? Wrong. The single worst day was still coming. And it came from the thing that was true the entire time. They were broke. And that is actually going to bring us back to where we started this video. In his memoir, Shoe Dog, Knight tells the story of 1975 like this. Nike is growing about as fast as a company can possibly grow. And because of the strategy, double every year, keep zero cash, they're living on what's called the float, counting on money technically in transit, timing payments to the day, robbing tomorrow to pay today. Knight owed Nisho around $1 million on a payment. To make it, he drained the company's accounts to nothing. And then past nothing. The checks started bouncing, and that includes payroll. And then the Bank of California saw bounced checks and froze the company's accounts, refused to honor them, and cut Blue Ribbon off. And then it got genuinely frightening, as if it weren't bad enough, because it turns out the way Knight had been juggling money between two different banks to stay alive, because of that, the bank suspected fraud and called the FBI. Now, this is the moment that I opened this video on. Payroll is bouncing, and his own people aren't getting paid. His bank just dropped him and froze everything. The FBI is looking at him for fraud, and he still owes a Japanese trading company $1 million he does not have on a company he spent 11 years and his entire adult life building. And by the way, federal bank fraud is not a slap on the wrist. It's prison time. So Knight wasn't just looking at losing his company, he was potentially looking at losing his freedom too. And the case against him on paper wasn't really that unreasonable. He had been pulling tricks with two banks at once to manage cash flow, and from the outside, that looks like exactly what fraud looks like. For days, Knight is barely sleeping, he's running numbers, he's calling his lawyer, he's just trying to keep his head above water, and he's trying to figure out which checks have already bounced and which haven't, who's going to find out first, what he tells the people on his payroll who didn't get paid, and on and on and on. The company isn't dead yet, but he's the only person in the world that knows that. And then on top of all of that, in May of the same year, his star runner, Steve Prefontaine, Bowerman's protege, Nike's first real face, 24 years old, was killed in a single car crash in Eugene. The closest thing this company had to a heart was gone. And this was all in the same calendar year as the FBI investigation. Knight tells it himself in the book. He really wasn't sure if he could keep going. So Knight goes to Nisho. And again, the way Knight tells it, he lays it all out to the Nisho executives. Not only can he not make the $1 million payment, he needs to borrow another $1 million. So the Nisho men go through Blue Ribbon's books, and what they find is genuinely incredible. Their own man assigned to the Blue Ribbon count, a guy named Sumeragi, had been quietly bending his own company's rules for years. He'd been hiding invoices in his desk drawer to give Knight more time on payments. A loyal employee of one of the largest trading houses in Japan had been breaking his own employer's procedures to keep this insane little American shoe company alive. And the senior Nisho executive, looking at the whole reckless, broke, overextended, FBI investigated, just lost its biggest athlete picture, Instead of pulling the plug, reportedly says this one line: there are worse things than ambition. So Nisho paid off Knight's debt to the Bank of California in full. They could have buried him, but they didn't. They backed him instead. The bank that called the FBI got walked out of the picture. The fraud cloud eventually cleared, and Nike lived. So we've talked about a lot, so I want to give you the whole thing in one place. For 16 years, Phil Knight ran a company the responsible way says should not have survived a single one of those years. He grew too fast, he kept no cash, he borrowed past the edge. Every banker told him to stop, and they were right about the risk every single time they told him that. And he was right about the opportunity. Barely, repeatedly by the skin of his teeth of one Japanese trading company that decided that ambition was worth backing. People think Nike is a story about a great shoe or a great logo or a great athlete or a great ad, and it just isn't. It's a story about a man who simply would not fall down, who took the most dangerous path in business, the undercapitalized all-out sprint, and survived it just long enough for the shoes to win. The genius wasn't the product. The genius was lasting. Now, Knight said this better than I ever could. He said, the people who tell you to never give up are charlatans, but don't ever stop. And for 16 years, he didn't stop. Now, once it owned its own brand and survived 1975, Nike just ran. The waffle trainer caught fire. The running boom of the 70s was the exact wave Knight had bet on in that Stanford paper, and it broke right on schedule. So in 1977, Nike ran an ad that didn't even show a shoe, just a lone runner on a road and 4 words: there is no finish line. The agency that made it was basically given one brief: write something that makes a runner feel good about themselves. They wrote those 4 words, and it was the first time Nike sold something that wasn't a product. It was selling an identity. And it came 11 years before their most famous slogan, which is just do it. Now, by the late 70s, Nike was big and getting bigger fast. The waffle trainer was a runaway hit. Revenue was doubling year over year over year. But Nike was still on the same broke on purpose model. They had bigger numbers, but they were still living check to check, still leveraged to the rafters, still one bad month from a problem they couldn't pay their way out of. The tightrope didn't end, the numbers just got bigger. And it was around this time that going public was supposed to fix all of that once and for all. It was the move that would finally let Knight stop running the financial cycle that had nearly killed his business 3 times already. But there was a problem. Knight refused to lose control of this company. Remember I told you earlier Knight retaining control would come back? Here we are. After surviving 16 years to keep it, he was not going to hand control to outside shareholders on the day that he went public. So Nike's IPO was structured in a very specific way. There were 2 classes of stock: Class A shares, which were held by Knight and the original team and controlled 3/4 of the board. Class B shares, the publicly traded ones, got 1 vote each, but couldn't outvote the insiders. Knight had spent 16 years not letting bankers tell him what to do, and he wasn't about to let Wall Street do it either. And the revenue tells the tightrope in one line of numbers. Under $2 million in 1972, by 1980, $269.8 million. From a $1,000 handshake and a trunk full of shoes to nearly $270 million a year in 16 years. On December 2nd, 1980, Nike went public. The stock priced at $22 a share. Apple went public 10 days later, by the way. Quick note, you'll see online that Nike's IPO price was 18 cents. That's wrong. That's the price worked backwards after decades of stock splits. The real price was $22. Now, when the dust settled on that IPO, the broke guy who'd kept his accounting job because his shoe company couldn't pay him yet, the guy whose checks had bounced 5 years earlier, was worth on paper about $178 million. His old track coach, Bowerman, from a $500 handshake, was worth around $9 million. And a handful of the earlier believers, including Jeff Johnson, who dreamed up the name, were millionaires too. So that's Phil, a crazy idea in a school paper, a company he invented in a half second in a room in Japan, $1,000, a borrowed 50, and a car trunk full of shoes, 16 years broke on purpose, with the bankers right and him righter, surviving the FBI in $1 million hole on the back of one Japanese trading house that decided ambition was worth saving. And everything you already know about Nike, Jordan, Just Do It, the comeback, the $46 billion a year, all of that happens after the part that I just told you. And we'll cover that in a future video, but none of it exists if he folds in 1975. The famous part is the easy part. This was the hard part. Like, if you take one thing from this video, have it be this: a good idea isn't enough. Half the people watching this have had a great idea, probably more. What separates the founders who actually build something from the ones who don't is they don't quit when it's still ugly. Knight had a good idea in 1962. So did a lot of people. But he's the one who didn't fold in 1975. Check out part 2 of the Nike story on this channel, and maybe even on your screen right now.